During my time at the PRI, I've been able to travel around the world, meeting our global signatories and policymakers, and hearing firsthand how their challenges and opportunities differ from market to market. And my overall view is that what's happening on the ground isn't necessarily the same as the impression you'd get from the media headlines. Sure, there are loud voices calling for more fossil fuels and the end of net zero. But when you look at the numbers, the work of preparing for the transition is moving steadily forward. Now, admittedly, we're still lacking a standard global carbon price, which is a major gap. But nonetheless, 2/3 of the world's largest companies are now working towards net zero. And at a global policy level, over 80% of the economy is covered by net zero targets. There are over 1,000 policy instruments across the G20 linked to corporate and financial sector transitions to net zero. And over 60% of the global GDP is now covered by jurisdictions that have made progress towards the full adoption of ISSB standards. And close to 60 sustainable finance taxonomies are developed or are in progress, with an ambition to cover more than 65% of the global GDP. To support the effectiveness of these new frameworks, as part of COP30 last year, the Brazilian government invited 6 international organisations, including the PRI, to work with them to develop protocols to enable interoperability between these various green taxonomies. So investors will now have the international frameworks to enable them to compare and contrast companies and assets based on agreed sustainability criteria. Now, in Europe, it's resetting its approach to regulation and standards, and I would expect that the current Iran conflict is only going to accelerate the desire for energy security in Europe, which is only achievable through renewables. Africa is the home to the world's fastest growing consumer economies in demographic terms. And these are economies and communities with a desire to be electrified and to be fully connected to the modern global economy. In Latin America, we're seeing strong leadership from Brazil, as already mentioned, alongside markets like Colombia and Chile. And even in the US, yes, the administration is pro-fossil fuels, and yes, that represents a material risk, but there's more to the story than that. Activity at the state level points to movement in the opposite direction. Texas currently generates more renewable electricity than any other US state, and California has introduced some of the most progressive and far-reaching mandatory climate disclosure requirements globally. And turning to Asia, which I think contains some of the most exciting markets in the world at the moment. So to sum up, climate change and the net zero transition are still seen as critical issues for investors in every corner of the globe. The global transition is not slowing down. In fact, it's accelerating, driven by competitiveness, energy security, and long-term growth opportunities. And when it comes to capitalising on that transition, Australia has one of the best starting positions in the world and has made great progress in recent years. Now it's about building on this important base into more investable pathways. Investors, particularly asset owners, want to make long-term sustainable risk returns out of this transition. So we should be working together with governments and future relevant industries, ensuring ongoing growth and prosperity for our nation and securing retirement pools for our people into the future.
So you mentioned 80% of signatories incorporate climate in some shape or form. Can you just unpack what does that actually mean in practical terms? For an audience here, we've got a mix of people. We've got some depth of investment expertise, but we've got people outside of investment as well. So how do investors do that, and how do they kind of know the outcomes they're getting as well when they do that?
So just starting from the macro level, I think the first thing is to make sure that in each of those sectors, you're integrating climate information into assessing those assets. If I take some of the, just building on the stats that I gave you, that increase of integrating climate from 80% is up from 71% the year before. We're starting to see more movement into translation of integration into action. 45% of the signatories have a process in place to manage climate-related risks, which is up from 30% the year before. And how they manage these risks varies, depends on the type of approach. But some examples of the way in which they do it, apart from integrating the information into decision-making, things like joining collaborative initiatives. Over 600 of our signatories from 38 countries are involved in collaborative initiatives, including the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Management Alliance, where they're engaging with companies. There are corporate engagement on risks and solutions, investing in climate adaptation solutions. For example, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which has about 80 pension funds and insurers, last year invested $500 billion into climate solutions. So we're seeing increasingly investors carve out in their portfolio specific strategies on climate adaptation. Also, they're beginning to require clear net zero targets being embedded in not only at a global level, but into local companies. And probably the most important thing I would say that we're starting to see investors do is engage with policymakers directly, because it's ultimately, it needs to be a compact between private and public sector, and governments need, if they're looking for the private sector to play a role, and institutional investors, there needs to be a better understanding about the policy settings that are required to accelerate capital being invested.